The morning it all began to unravel started the way most mornings did in the Mercer house. Quietly, efficiently, and entirely without gratitude. Nora Santos had been awake since 4:30, not because anyone asked her to be, not because it was written in any contract or posted on any schedule. She woke that early because the Mercer house had a rhythm, and Nora had learned long ago that if you wanted to stay inside that rhythm, you had to be the one setting the beat. By the time the first winter light crept across the marble floors of the kitchen, Nora had already brewed 2 pots of coffee. One strong and black for Daniel Mercer, one with a splash of oat milk, and 2 exact cubes of sugar for Victoria. She had ironed the tablecloth Daniel never seemed to notice. I arranged the fresh flowers she clipped from the side garden, the way old Margaret had once told her she preferred them, and set the breakfast table with the kind of silent precision that only the truly invisible ever develop. That was what the Mercer house had made of Nora Santos over 3 years. Invisible. She didn't resent it the way some people might. Resentment was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had a daughter back home, 8-year-old Camille, who had her mother's dark eyes and her late father's stubborn chin. And every early morning, every carefully placed napkin, every polished floor was a step closer to Camille's school fees, to the small house Nora was trying to build, brick by brick, from 12,000 miles away. So Nora worked. She stayed invisible. She told herself it was enough. It was enough until the morning Victoria Mercer came downstairs in her silk robe, phone pressed to her ear, and walked directly into the flower arrangement as if it weren't there. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The vase tipped. Water spread across the white tablecloth in a slow, cold wave, and Victoria spun around with the particular anger of someone who has never once had to clean up after themselves. "Nora." Her voice was flat, not rising, not sharp, the kind of flat that is more dangerous than shouting because it doesn't need to raise itself to cut. "What is this?" Nora was already moving, already reaching for the dish towel, and already absorbing the disaster the way she absorbed everything in this house, swiftly, silently, and without complaint. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. I'll fix it right away." Victoria watched her mop up the water with the particular brand of contempt reserved for people who consider their time too valuable to acknowledge another person's effort. She pulled the phone away from her ear, long enough to speak to whoever was on the other end. Nora heard the name, Brianna, one of Victoria's lunch friends, and then laughed at something, bright and airy, as though the mess at her feet had already ceased to exist. Then she said it. Not cruelly, not even loudly. She said it the way people say something they have always believed to be true, the kind of truth they have never once examined, because it has never once needed to be. She said it to Brianna the way you'd mention a piece of furniture you purchased and stopped noticing. "Oh, don't worry about the noise. It's just the maid." Just the maid. Nora wrung out the dish towel over the sink, her back turned. She let the water run cold over her hands for a moment longer than necessary, and she breathed, slow and measured, the way her own mother had taught her. The same way you breathe when you are standing inside a storm, and the only shelter available is yourself. She didn't say anything. She never did. And that, in the Mercer house, was how a person could disappear completely. Daniel Mercer was not a cruel man. That was the thing about him. The thing that made everything that followed so much more complicated than a simple story about wealth and contempt. Daniel was the kind of person who held elevator doors for strangers, who remembered the names of his clients' children, who had once, years ago when the company was still small, driven a junior employee home in a snowstorm because he couldn't bear the thought of her standing at a bus stop in the cold. He was not cruel. He was absent. There is a particular kind of absence that successful people practice without ever knowing they've learned it. The art of being physically present in a room while being entirely somewhere else in their minds. Daniel Mercer had mastered it. He sat at his breakfast table each morning, reading news on his tablet, coffee going cold at his elbow, and he could spend 20 minutes in the same kitchen as Nora without once registering her as a person. She was part of the house, for the way the crown molding was part of the house, the way the hum of the refrigerator was part of the house. Background. Necessary but unexamined. He did notice her sometimes, the way you notice something that has always worked correctly. Briefly, and only when you're already moving on to the next thing. He knew her name. He said good morning most days. Once, he had asked if she'd had a good weekend, and seemed genuinely surprised when she mentioned visiting a sick friend's child in the hospital. He'd said, "That's kind of you." And then his phone had rung, and the conversation had dissolved the way conversations do when one person is already halfway out the door. But there were things happening inside the Mercer house that Daniel did not know. Things that happened in the East Wing, behind the pale blue door at the end of the long hallway he rarely walked down anymore. Things that happened in the quiet hours before anyone else stirred, and in the soft, late-night spaces when the whole house went still. Daniel's mother, Margaret Mercer, was 73 years old, and she had been living in the East Wing for 14 months. She had moved in after a fall, a hip that had objected to a set of stairs with more force than anyone anticipated, and the original arrangement was meant to be temporary. 6 weeks of recovery, maybe 8. But 6 weeks had stretched into 3 months, and 3 months into 6, and somewhere in that unexamined stretch of time, Margaret's health had shifted the way elderly people's health sometimes does, quietly, gradually, like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice the shore has changed until you're standing somewhere unfamiliar. Victoria had managed all of it. The doctors, the medication schedules, the insurance paperwork, the therapy appointments. Daniel had trusted her with it, the way he trusted her, with the household accounts and the school schedules and the dozen other invisible labors that kept a family intact. Victoria was efficient. She handled things. What Daniel did not know was that Victoria had stopped handling his mother approximately 4 months ago. Nora had seen it happen. Not in a single dramatic moment. That was not how these things worked. But in small, accumulating absences. A medication chart left unfilled. A prescription that ran out and was never replaced. A physical therapy schedule that quietly collapsed. So a doctor's follow-up canceled once, then canceled again, without anyone informing Daniel. Margaret's world shrinking, week by week, to the dimensions of a single room. And what Nora had done, quietly, carefully, telling no one, was fill the gap. She held a nursing license from the Philippines, though it transferred to nothing here. She had worked 4 years in a public hospital in Manila, before her father's illness dismantled everything, before the mathematics of survival had led her here, to a foreign country, a uniform, a position that erased a decade of education, and replaced it with the phrase, just the maid. The license didn't cross borders. The knowledge did. She knew how to read a medication chart. She knew the difference between the fog of loneliness and the fog of a missed dose. And she knew that Margaret's ankles should not be swelling the way they sometimes were. And she knew what that meant. And she knew what needed to be done. So every morning, before Victoria descended in her silk robe, Nora would knock softly on the pale blue door and carry in a breakfast tray. Soft boiled eggs and toast cut into triangles, because Margaret had once mentioned it was how her own mother had made it, and some things from childhood you never stop reaching for. She would sit for a few minutes, never long, never in a way that could be seen, and called something it wasn't. And she would listen. Sometimes Margaret talked about memories, sometimes about the garden she could no longer walk in. Sometimes she simply needed to hear another voice say her name like it mattered. Then Nora would check the medications, note the swelling, assess the color in the old woman's face, adjust what needed adjusting, and go back downstairs and be invisible again before anyone else appeared. She did this because it was right, not because she expected thanks, not because she imagined Daniel would ever know. She did it because Margaret Mercer was a person, and persons deserve to be seen. And Nora, perhaps more than anyone inside those marble walls, understood what it meant to live inside a large house and feel profoundly, completely alone. The other thing Daniel Mercer did not know about his own house was his daughter. Lily Mercer was 8 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a way of looking at the world that was slightly sidelong, and slightly measuring, as though she was always calculating the distance between what people said and what they actually meant. Her school teacher had described her as behind. 2 educational consultants had offered variations of the same word with professional care, as though softening the packaging changed what was inside. Lily was not keeping up. Victoria had received this information with the brisk efficiency she applied to most inconveniences. She had nodded, requested something in writing, and told Daniel over dinner that their daughter was a little slow and that they would look into options. The options had not materialized. The written report sat in the study drawer. And Lily continued coming home from school with the particular slumped posture of a child who has been told, in 100 small ways, that something inside her does not work correctly. Nora had noticed. Of course she had. It had started 4 months ago when Lily left her reading workbook on the kitchen table, and Nora, carrying it upstairs, had glanced at the assignment inside, a second-grade comprehension worksheet. Simple questions. Lily had answered every single one, and every single one was wrong. But not wrong in the random way of a child who hasn't tried. Wrong in a specific, traceable pattern that Nora, who had spent 2 years as a classroom aide before nursing school, recognized immediately. Lily wasn't failing to understand the words. She was failing to sequence them. They were arriving in her mind in the wrong order, like a film reel cut and reassembled by someone who didn't know the story. Nora had set the workbook on Lily's desk and said nothing that day. But the next afternoon, when the house was quiet and Victoria's car was gone, she knocked on Lily's door and asked simply if she'd like some help. Lily had looked at her with those careful eyes and said very seriously, "Mom says I'm just slow." Nora had sat down on the edge of the bed and said, with equal seriousness, "Your mom is wrong." It was the boldest thing Nora Santos had said in 3 years inside the Mercer house. And Lily, perhaps because she had been waiting for someone to say exactly that, had burst into tears. They worked together every afternoon after that, never longer than 40 minutes, always finished before any cars pulled into the driveway. Nora had borrowed 3 books on reading intervention from the public library, checked out on her own card, and worked through them the way she had once worked through nursing textbooks, methodically, practically, taking what was useful and setting aside what wasn't. She discovered that Lily's mind loved patterns when they were made spatial, made visible, made physical. So Nora drew maps with her. Story maps, sentence maps, little visual diagrams that looked more like treasure charts than homework. 6 weeks in, Lily read an entire page aloud without stopping, and looked up at Nora with an expression that Nora knew she would carry long after she had left this house. "I did it," Lily whispered. You did, Nora said. Did you know I could? Yes, Nora said. From the very beginning. Victoria Mercer did not know any of this, or perhaps she had chosen not to know, which is a different kind of not knowing, the willful kind, the kind that requires active effort to maintain. What Victoria knew was that the household ran smoothly, that there were no disasters she had to manage personally, that the East Wing was quiet and therefore fine, and that Lily's situation was being looked into. She had a lunch on Thursdays, a charity committee on Tuesdays, a trainer on Monday and Friday mornings, and a social calendar requiring as much management as a small business. She was not, she told herself, a bad woman. She was a busy woman, a managing woman, a woman who had married into considerable wealth and built her life around maintaining it. She was also a woman who had been spending money that was not hers to spend. It had started small. It always does. Not a reallocation here, an adjustment there, rerouting Margaret's medical budget to cover other things, things that felt, if you tilted your head and didn't look directly at them, like reasonable priorities. Margaret was stable. The physical therapy was expensive, and the results were, to Victoria's eye, minimal. The doctors could be spaced further apart. The savings could be better used. Better used had, over 14 months, become approximately $60,000, and the prescriptions had not been covered, and the doctors had been canceled. And the only thing standing between Margaret Mercer and a serious health crisis, the only warm, steady hand holding that door closed, was a woman Victoria had dismissed with 3 words on a Tuesday morning phone call. Just the maid. The day everything began to change was a Tuesday in early December, when the first real cold of winter settled over the neighborhood like a held breath. Nora was in the East Wing when it happened. She had brought Margaret her mid-morning tea and noticed, the moment the old woman turned toward her, that something was wrong. Not dramatically. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself. The quiet kind, the kind she had been trained to read. A slight confusion behind Margaret's eyes, words arriving a fraction slower than usual. The particular way she held her left hand in her lap, still, unused, as though she had forgotten it was there. Nora set the tea down without a word and took Margaret's hand in both of hers. Margaret, she said. She always called her Margaret in private, because the old woman had asked her to, had said, Mrs. Mercer was my mother-in-law's name, and she was a terror. Please don't saddle me with it. I need you to squeeze my hand. The right hand squeezed firmly. The left barely responded. Nora kept her face very still. She had learned this in the hospital, that in moments of medical urgency, the expression you show the patient matters as much as anything else. She checked blood pressure with the small cuff she kept in her room, noted the number, and felt something in her chest tighten to a single, precise point. I'm going to make a call, she said. Nothing to worry about. A precaution. Margaret looked at her with the clear-eyed trust of someone who has been genuinely cared for long enough to recognize the real thing. Is it bad? Nora squeezed her hand. It's going to be fine, she said, because we caught it. She stepped into the hallway, pulled out her phone, and called Daniel. Not Victoria. Daniel. She had never called him directly before. His number was in the household emergency contacts, and this, she decided in the space between one heartbeat and the next, qualified as exactly that. He picked up on the second ring, voice distracted, clearly mid-meeting. Hello? Mr. Mercer. Nora kept her voice level. It's Nora, from the house. A single beat of silence. You need to come home. A pause. She heard him shift, a chair, A door. The background noise of his office suddenly muffled. When he spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. "What's happened?" "Your mother," Nora said. Nora. She chose her next words with the same care she had given to every word spoken inside this house for 3 years. But this time, not for her own protection, for accuracy. "I believe she may have had a small stroke. She needs to be seen today." The silence on the other end had a different weight now. Dense. Unsteady. Victoria said she was... The last update I got was... "Please come home, Mr. Mercer," Nora said quietly. "I'll explain everything when you arrive." She hung up and stood for a moment in the pale blue hallway, with her phone pressed against her sternum, and the winter light falling cold through the window at the far end. She understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, what she had just done. Calling Daniel directly, stepping around Victoria, speaking from her own knowledge, making herself visible and undeniable, had changed something. Something that could not be walked back. She had stepped out of the background, and she could not step back in. She returned to Margaret and took her hand and talked about nothing, about everything, about the garden and what she planned to plant come spring, about the funny thing Lily had said during their reading session the day before. She kept her voice warm and even and unhurried. She watched the clock on the bedside table. She waited. And downstairs, in the cold marble foyer of the Mercer house, a key turned in the front lock. Daniel Mercer was coming home in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon for the first time in longer than anyone, including his own mother, could remember. And from that moment forward, nothing in that house would be the same. And Daniel Mercer had a particular way of walking into a room, shoulders squared, pace measured, the practiced entry of a man who had spent 20 years ensuring that every room he walked into understood he was in charge. He walked that way into his own foyer on that Tuesday afternoon in December, and then he heard his mother's voice, drifting faintly from the east wing, and his shoulders dropped in a way no boardroom had ever seen. Nora was at the top of the stairs when he appeared below. She had Margaret's medication record in her hand, a folder she had kept herself, because the official one had gone unmaintained for months. She descended without rushing, because rushing communicated panic, and panic was not what this moment needed. Daniel stared at her. She could see him recalibrating, or recategorizing, reaching for the version of her he had always held, and finding it insufficient. Because the woman coming down his staircase with a medical folder and a steady gaze was not the woman who appeared on the edges of his mornings, silent and useful as furniture. She was something else entirely, and his brain was working to catch up. "Where is she?" he asked. "East wing. Resting. She's stable." Nora reached the bottom of the stairs and held out the folder. "I want you to look at this before we go up." Daniel took it the way you take something handed to you by someone whose authority you haven't yet decided how to categorize. He opened it. His eyes moved across the page, across dates and medication names and pressure readings and small, neat notations and handwriting that was precise the way medical records are precise, not the way household staff write reminders on Post-it notes. He looked up. "You did this?" "Yes." "When did..." He stopped, looked back at the folder, a date at the top of the first page. 14 months ago. His jaw tightened. "This goes back over a year." "Yes, Mr. Mercer." He turned another page. Another. His eyes stopped on a column of entries, and Nora watched him read without speaking, because she had learned, in hospitals, in difficult conversations, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay very still and let the truth do its own work. "Her prescriptions," Daniel said slowly. "There are gaps here." He looked up. "Months of gaps." "Yes." Why? His voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not corporate, not absent. Raw, the voice of a son. No, why was she going without— I filled them when I could, Nora said carefully. When the prescriptions lapsed, I researched alternatives within my scope and ensured she wasn't without something critical. I contacted her doctor's office twice under the household account to request renewals. She paused. Both times, the appointments were canceled before they could be rescheduled. Daniel stared at her. Canceled by whom? Nora held his gaze. She did not answer. She didn't need to. The answer moved across his face in real time. A slow, terrible sunrise of understanding. Victoria manages all of that, he said, half to himself. His voice had gone very quiet. She told me Mom was doing well, that the therapy was ongoing, that the doctors were pleased. He set the folder against his side and looked at the East Wing hallway, the way a man looks at a door he's afraid to open because he already suspects what's on the other side. I believed her. I know, Nora said. There was no accusation in her voice. She was not angry on her own behalf. She had never been angry on her own behalf. It was not something she had the luxury of sustaining. But she was very clear, in the way that people who have been invisible for a long time are clear when they finally decide to be seen, about what she knew and what she had done with it. I need to take her to the hospital today, Nora said. The symptoms are consistent with a transient ischemic attack, a TIA, sometimes called a mini-stroke. She kept her tone clinical, but precise, the kind of tone that anchors people who are starting to drift into panic. If it is what I believe it is, the good news is that we caught it. The risk is that a TIA often precedes something larger, and we need imaging today. Daniel was already nodding, phone out, already dialing. Then he stopped, looked at her again. How do you know this? I'm a nurse, Nora said. Or I was. Here, I am not. A simple statement. No bitterness. In the Philippines, I worked in a hospital for 4 years before circumstances changed. The license doesn't carry over. The look on Daniel Mercer's face in that moment was one Nora would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was the most human expression she had ever seen on him. A man realizing that he had been living inside a story he thought he understood, and that virtually every significant detail had been wrong. My God, he said softly. Then, thank you. And for once in this house, those 2 words had weight. The hospital was a 40-minute drive, and Daniel made it in 32. Nora sat in the back with Margaret, holding her hand, narrating the passing streets in the quiet, distracting way she had learned, kept anxious patients from spiraling inward. Margaret talked a little. She asked where they were going. She asked, with the slightly blurred speech of the afternoon, whether Nora had eaten. Even now. Even in this. Are you all right, Nora? Have you eaten? Nora had pressed her lips together and said she was perfectly fine, and that Margaret should stop worrying about other people. And Margaret had made a sound that was almost a laugh and said, "That's what people say when they're lying, dear." In the front seat, Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and his entire body rigid with the particular tension of a man processing too much information at once and not yet knowing which piece to look at first. At the hospital, the intake was swift. Nora's calm, specific summary of symptoms, timing, and medical history moved them past the usual delays. A doctor appeared. Tests were ordered. And Daniel stood in the hallway outside the imaging suite with Nora, and the hospital around them hummed with its own indifferent urgency. And after a long silence, he said, "Tell me everything." So she did. Not everything. Not yet. Not all of it. but the shape of it. Margaret's care, the medications, the canceled appointments, the way the East Wing had gone from a temporary arrangement to something quietly, deliberately forgotten. She spoke in the measured, factual way of someone who has rehearsed nothing but knows the material completely. And Daniel listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor and did not interrupt once. When she finished, the silence between them had a different texture than any silence they had shared in 3 years of the same household. "The money," Daniel said. Not a question. He was working it out himself, and she could see it. The same slow, terrible sunrise. "Her medical budget. I set aside a significant amount when she moved in. Victoria managed the accounts." He exhaled. "Where did it go?" Nora said nothing. She had not touched that question. That question belonged to him. "I'll find out," Daniel said. His voice had gone very flat. Not angry, yet. The thing before anger. The cold thing. He looked at her then, directly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It was the question she had known was coming. She had her answer ready, not because she had prepared it, but because she had lived it. "Because I am the maid, Mr. Mercer," she said simply. "People in my position don't walk into a man's study and tell him his wife has been lying to him. We don't walk anywhere we haven't been invited. We stay in the parts of the house we're allowed to occupy, and we do what we can within those borders." She looked at him steadily. "No, I did what I could." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in one of the plastic hospital chairs and pressed his hands over his face. And for several seconds, the CEO, the deal-maker, the man who had never once in 20 years been uncertain about what to do next, had no idea what to do next. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories. Like this one. Margaret's results came back 2 hours later. The doctor confirmed a transient ischemic attack. Small, caught early, no permanent damage evident. A significant medication adjustment was needed. Follow-up imaging in 48 hours. She would need to stay overnight for monitoring, and after that, a formal care plan. A real one. Daniel stood at his mother's bedside and held her hand, and did not speak for a long time. Margaret looked at him with the clear, patient eyes of a woman who had always understood more than anyone gave her credit for. "She told you," she said. Not a question. "Mom." His voice cracked slightly on the word. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" Margaret turned her head slowly toward the window. The winter sky outside had gone the pale gray of late afternoon, soft and directionless. "Because you were busy," she said. "And because I didn't want to be a burden. And because—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Because that woman made it very clear, in 100 small ways, that I was an inconvenience inside my own son's house. And after a while, you start to believe it." Daniel's hand tightened over hers. "Nora never believed it," Margaret said. Her voice softened. "She knocked on my door every morning like I was someone worth knocking for. She sat with me. She fixed what she could fix, and she stayed for the rest of it. I don't know how to make you understand what that means when you've been made to feel like you're disappearing." She looked at her son. "She saved my life, Daniel. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Every single morning, 1 cup of tea at a time." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing adequate enough to say. He drove home alone. Nora had stayed at the hospital. Margaret had asked her to, had held her wrist with surprising grip and said, "Please don't go yet." And Nora had stayed because of course she had. She had called a neighbor to check on her own small apartment, had eaten something from the hospital cafeteria, and had settled into the chair beside Margaret's bed with the quiet self-containment of someone who has long since stopped requiring comfort from their surroundings. Daniel pulled into his own driveway at 8:15 in the evening and sat for a moment in the dark car. Inside the house, lights were on. He could see Victoria's silhouette through the kitchen window. She was on the phone, gesturing, animated, entirely unaware. And somewhere upstairs, Lily was probably doing whatever Lily did in the evenings, which Daniel realized with a sick drop in his stomach that he did not actually know. He thought about what Nora had said. "I am the maid. We stay in the parts of the house we're allowed to occupy, and we do what we can within those borders." And then he thought about what she had done within those borders. He got out of the car. Victoria turned when he came through the kitchen door, expression shifting through a rapid sequence. Surprise, recalibration, the practiced smile. "You're late. I was starting to worry. How is... Mom is in the hospital," Daniel said. The smile froze. "What?" "TIA. Small stroke." He set his keys on the counter. His voice was very controlled. Not the cold flat of the car ride. Something more deliberate now. The tone of a man who has decided to be extremely careful with each word because he knows the conversation that's coming is one he will not be able to unhave. "Nora called me this afternoon. She noticed the symptoms." Victoria blinked. "Nora, she called you directly?" "She did." He looked at his wife. "She's been managing Mom's care for 14 months. A beat." Victoria's expression did something complicated. "She's the housekeeper, Daniel. She's not qualified to..." "She's a nurse." He said it quietly. "Qualified in the Philippines. 4 years of hospital experience. And she has been using that knowledge in this house, in secret, to keep my mother alive, while the prescriptions lapsed, and the appointments were canceled, and the medical budget..." His voice caught. He took a breath. "Where is it, Victoria? The money I set aside for her care?" The silence that followed had a specific quality. The silence of someone who has been found out and is making rapid calculations about how to respond. Nora had seen this kind of silence from across a kitchen. She recognized its particular texture. Victoria's chin lifted. "I managed the household expenses. Things needed to be reallocated. Your mother's condition wasn't as serious as the doctors were making it out to be, and the therapy wasn't showing results, and I made practical decisions." $60,000, Daniel said. He had run the numbers in the car. "Give or take, over 14 months. Practical decisions." Daniel. "While my mother sat alone in the East Wing." He crossed his arms. His voice had not risen. It would not rise. That was not who he was. But there was something behind the quiet that was worse than volume. "While Nora Santos, who I paid minimum wage, who my wife referred to this morning as just the maid, while she used her own knowledge, her own time, on to give my mother what we had stopped giving her." Victoria's composure was slipping now at the edges. "You're making this into something. I'm making it into exactly what it is," Daniel said. Another silence. And then, from the doorway, a small voice. "Is Grandma Margaret okay?" They both turned. Lily stood at the kitchen entrance in her pajamas, barefoot, hair loose, holding a paperback book against her chest. One of the library books Nora had brought home. Nora had left it on the hall table. Lily must have picked it up. She looked from her father to her mother with those careful, measuring eyes. Daniel crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and crouched down to Lily's level. "Grandma is going to be fine," he said. "She's at the hospital and the doctors are looking after her, and she's going to be fine." He took a breath. "Well, what are you reading?" Lily held up the book, a chapter book, 4th grade level, with a rabbit on the cover. "Nora and I are reading it together," she said. "I'm on chapter 7. We do 30 minutes every afternoon." Daniel looked at the book, then at his daughter. "You're reading chapter books?" Lily blinked, confused by his tone. "Yes. Nora says I was never slow. I just needed a different map." A pause. "She drew me maps for the words, so I can see where they go." She said this the way children say things that are obviously true, without performance, without drama, without any understanding of how hard the truth she was carrying would land. Daniel stood up very slowly. He turned to look at Victoria. Victoria looked at the floor, and in the kitchen of the Mercer house, and in the space between a man and his wife, and the small girl in her pajamas, who had just told them, without meaning to, the full scope of what they had both failed to see. The shape of everything became inescapably, undeniably clear. That night, after Lily was back in bed and the house had gone still, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the household accounts open in front of him. He went through 14 months of records with the same focused attention he gave to corporate audits, line by line, methodical, following every thread. What he found was not one large crime. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse. Dozens of small redirections, small adjustments, small decisions made in small increments over a long stretch of time, each one defensible in isolation, each one devastating in aggregate. The medical fund, drained through transfers disguised as household maintenance. The therapy appointments, canceled and logged as patient declined. The prescriptions, unreplaced, the cost absorbed back into a general account that had fattened quietly while his mother's medication cabinet went bare. He closed the laptop at midnight. He sat in the silence of his house for a long time. Then he called the hospital and asked to be put through to his mother's room. The phone rang 3 times, and then Nora answered, because of course she was still there. "She's sleeping," Nora said softly, comfortably. "Her pressure is much better." "Good," he exhaled. "Nora, I need to ask you something." "Yes." "Lily." He pressed his fingers to his eyes. "For how long has she been? How long have you been working with her?" A pause. 4 months. "And you think she's bright," Nora said. The directness of it cut clean through the phone line. "She has a specific learning difference with text sequencing, not uncommon, very manageable. She has been told by enough people that she is slow that she had almost started to believe it." Another pause. "She doesn't believe it anymore." Daniel's throat tightened. "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. He already knew the answer. "I am the maid. We stay in the parts of the house we're allowed to occupy." "I should have asked sooner," he said. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have seen all of it." "You see it now," Nora said simply. He closed his eyes. Outside, so the December wind moved through the bare trees, and the house settled around him. The beautiful, expensive, well-maintained shell of a life he had trusted other people to manage while he looked the other way. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow. Properly. He stopped. "There are things I need to say to you, about your position here, about what you've done, and I intend to say them." A short silence. Then Nora said carefully, "Mr. Mercer, whatever you decide about my position, I only want you to know that I would do it all again. Every morning. Every afternoon with Lily. All of it." A pause. "Your family deserved to be looked after." Daniel sat alone in his kitchen and felt the full weight of 3 years pressed down on his chest like a hand. Not guilt alone, and something more complicated. The particular shame of a good man who has confused delegation with care and outsourced his most important responsibilities to people he barely looked at. He thought about his mother asking, "Are you all right, Nora? Have you eaten?" He thought about Lily saying, "Nora says I was never slow. I just needed a different map." He thought about a woman who carried a nursing license that crossed no borders, who held years of training that earned her nothing here, who had walked into a house and been told by its very atmosphere that she was background, and had looked at the people inside it anyway and decided, quietly and without asking for anything in return, that they were worth caring for. The question that settled in Daniel Mercer that night, settling the way something settles when it is heavy enough to stay, was not what to do about Victoria. That question had a clear, if painful, answer. The question that sat with him until morning was simpler and harder and more important than any of the rest of it. What do you do when the person who held everything together has been doing it in secret? What do you owe someone who asked for nothing? And how do you begin to make right something that should never have needed fixing in the first place? He didn't sleep. He sat with the question. He let it do its work. And when the first gray light of Wednesday morning came through the kitchen window, Daniel Mercer stood up, put on his coat, and drove back to the hospital. Because for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, there was somewhere he needed to be, and someone who deserved to see him show up. He found her in the chair beside his mother's bed, exactly where he had left her. Margaret was still sleeping. The room was pale with early morning light, and Nora had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes open, watching the window, the way people watch windows when they have been awake all night, holding something together through sheer will. She looked up when he stepped in. She didn't look surprised. Daniel set a coffee cup on the table beside her, hospital cafeteria, the only thing available at 6 in the morning, and sat in the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The machines beeped softly. Margaret's breathing was steady and even. "I owe you something," Daniel said. Nora looked at the coffee cup. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you 3 years," he said. "At minimum." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been on the phone since 4 this morning, with my attorney, with HR, with the board." He paused. "Victoria will be leaving the house. The financial matter is being referred to our legal team. What she did to my mother's care, that's not something I can absorb and move past." Nora was very still. "I also called a colleague of mine," Daniel continued. "Dr. Amelia Park. She runs the largest private rehabilitation clinic in the city. I told her I had an exceptional nurse, experienced, skilled, calm under pressure, who needed a pathway to get her credentials recognized here." He looked at Nora directly. "She's expecting your call." Nora's lips parted. She closed them, opened them again. "Mr. Mercer, your daughter," he said quietly. "Camille, 8 years old." Nora went very still. "I found her name in the emergency contacts you filed when you started with us. I would like, if you are willing, to have my attorney look at what a family visa pathway might look like. I'm not making promises about things I can't control, but I can make calls. I can open doors." He held her gaze. "You've been opening doors in this house for 3 years. Let someone open one for you." For the first time in 3 years inside the Mercer household, Nora Santos could not hold her expression still. It moved, quietly, privately, the way deep water moves when something finally surfaces. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled but did not spill. "She would love it here," Nora whispered. "Camille, she would love the garden." "Then she should see it," Daniel said simply. Behind them, Margaret stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, found Nora first, as they always did, and then found her son. She looked between them with the clear, patient expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the people she loves to finally see what she has always seen. "Good morning," Margaret said softly. "Both of you." And in that pale December light, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee, and something quietly like grace, Daniel Mercer finally understood what his mother had always known, that the most valuable person in his house had never been listed on any asset sheet. She had simply shown up, every single morning, and loved them without being asked. There is a kind of wealth that never appears in any account. It doesn't compound. It doesn't earn interest. It lives in the quiet acts of people who give without calculation, who see a person disappearing and refuse to look away. Nora Santos had carried an entire family on a foundation they never knew existed. She asked for nothing. She announced nothing. She simply stayed and cared, and trusted that the truth has a way of finding the surface eventually. It always does. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.